welcome to the Primi Chats, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. CPBF is a charitable organization, and our mission is to empower families of premature babies through support and education. This Primi Chat series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for NICU families and healthcare professionals. Here every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us their experience and knowledge. Also on our website, canadianprimis.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. One of them is the Parent Care Program. We're offering 4 free therapy sessions for families who are currently in the NICU up to 3 years post-discharge. To learn more about our program, visit our website, canadianprimis.org. And today we're going to talk about honoring Indigenous parents and families as their children's first teachers. This talk will speak to the Martin Family Initiative Early Years program and the way it is supporting Indigenous parents, young children, and families through community-led initiatives that prioritize child well-being. The Martin Family Initiative, or MFI, is a private not-for-profit committed to improving education, health, and overall well-being outcomes of Indigenous children in Canada. MFI works in partnership with Indigenous people, schools, and communities, governments, other foundations, and private sector partners to support Indigenous-led transformation of essential services. And to talk about the Early Years program, I have here Chloe Ferguson, the program director, joining us live from Montreal. She directed the development of the Early Years, an innovative evidence-informed approach that brings together community knowledge and leadership across the health, education, and social services domains to effectively support Indigenous women, children, and their families. She's currently leading the implementation, expansion, and evaluation of the program in collaboration with multiple Indigenous community and organizational partners. Chloe was formerly Chief of Staff to the Right Honorable Paul Martin, former Prime Minister of Canada, and founder of MFI. She completed a Bachelor of Arts at McGill University and a Master of Arts in Journalism at London College of Communication, completing her dissertation on the representation of Indigenous protests in Canadian print media. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us here today. I am so honored to have you and learn more about this incredible initiative.
Thank you for having me. As you know, I think the work that you do is so important, and certainly in my experience have found that the kinds of resources you're providing are ones that every parent can benefit from.
Thank you. And for all of you watching us live today, we will have a period of Q&A at the end of Chloe's presentation. Chloe, the floor is yours.
Great. I apologize in advance. There's a bit of a issue with some of my slides, so hopefully for those of you watching it on a computer, it isn't too confusing. So I really wanted to start by giving a bit of background about the Martin Family Initiative, who we are and the kinds of programs we run. The Maternal Health and Young Early Years program is just one of the programs we run. And then I will talk a little bit about the origins of the Early Years and how the program came to be and how we approached the development of the initiative and our role as a private foundation in that development, working with partners. And then I can speak a little bit to what the program looks like today, how it is being implemented in different places across the country, and a bit around the outcomes that we're seeing. And finally, I'm looking forward to having some discussion with Fabiana and with all of you to answer any questions that this conversation may bring up. So to begin with, the Martin Family Initiative, as Fabiana mentioned, was founded by the Right Honorable Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister of Canada, as well as Finance Minister. And his goal in starting the foundation was really to increase opportunities to Indigenous children and youth across the country. And so that began with his experience in business So he started with an entrepreneurship program. So a program focused on supporting youth at the high school level in understanding their role in the economy, in financial literacy, and in starting small businesses. And that program has been running for about 10 years since the foundation started, and is in 50 schools across the country and always growing, supporting, as I mentioned, high school students primarily. However, this year we are beginning to offer more adult level programs, as well as programming for younger kids, so entrepreneurship training or courses in school, starting in middle school. So that's sort of the first focus area. The second focus area is around literacy. So teacher training and school improvement at the literacy level, kindergarten to third grade. And that program is in 20 schools across the country, in elementary schools on reserve, and again, really focuses on that kindergarten to third grade key period of learning to read and write. And so from both of these programs, which were the first two programs that MFI started, we as an organization started to recognize that while the programs were being successful and we were starting to see outcomes and we had positive feedback, there was really more that we could be doing. And what we were hearing at the community level was that the definition of education needed to expand beyond just a school-based setting. And as so many of you as parents know, learning begins, from the womb. And by the time you reach kindergarten, there's so much that has already happened to affect a child's education. And so what we heard from partners was we needed to start thinking about the social determinants of education, all of those things that surrounded kids before they got to school, their home environments, their parents, interaction with social services, nutrition, their community context. And so from there, we started to look at examples of programs that were running in other communities across the country, and talk to a lot of experts. And that brought us to really understanding the core brain development story and the massive opportunity that exists in the first 5 years of life to better support children and their families, better support parents, to ensure that critical time families have as much support as they can have to make that the most positive, healthy time possible for their kids. So that brings us to the early years. And the early years, as I mentioned, came out of this understanding of and this recognition of the first 5 years of life. So as I'm sure most of you watching know and have thought a lot about and are learning a lot about, is just how much is happening at that time of life, both in the womb and in those earliest days. And so after talking to the expertise, many of the researchers probably who have joined these chats before, there's so much incredible expertise in Canada, as well as looking at examples of programs that were providing these comprehensive wraparound supports for parents in both Indigenous contexts in the United States and in Canada, as well as non-Indigenous contexts across the country. We came to a couple of key things. The first one being that across cultures and societies, there is an incredibly powerful love and hope, perhaps the strongest form of love and hope that exists, that every parent has for their child. Every parent wants the best for their child. And so if we could catalyze that desire, that power, then we would be successful. And so the goal became to first and foremost honor parents as their children's first and most important teachers. That if we did nothing else but to communicate to parents that they were the best thing for their kids, then we would have done our job. That idea that it's love that builds a child's brain is the idea that we really started from. I'll go back to that one for a second. And so what we heard from community members and from partner organizations was that we needed to approach this early childhood period from a more holistic perspective than had previously been approached. We did begin the development of the program on reserve, working with 2 communities in central and southern Alberta. And so the on-reserve context is a bit different in terms of the health and social services available, but typically they have been quite siloed in their funding, and that trickles down to how programs are delivered. So there hasn't typically been a lot of collaboration between health and education and social services. And they are systems that are extremely overloaded. As we all know. And so what we heard was that we really needed to approach this early years from the perspective of health, early learning, and access to social services needed to be integrated. And that it needed to start prenatally and continue until children entered school in some way. There needed to be some kind of service delivered throughout that whole period. And that it needed to not only include mothers, but fathers, grandparents, aunties, uncles. In the family context that we were working in, there were many family members involved in a children's earliest years, often living in the same home, and creating programs that included whole families as strengthening factors for that child was really important. And so we began the program, a pilot of the program in central Alberta in one community, the Ermineskin Cree Nation, working with the Education Authority, the Health Authority, as well as the nation leadership itself. And the program began as a home visiting program. So it paired community-based workers, almost all of whom were mothers themselves, with young or grown children, some mothers, some grandmothers, to walk alongside new parents, beginning prenatally when moms were pregnant and up until school entry. And their purpose was to support them with healthy pregnancies for sure, but also with positive early learning, language development, play, beginning as early on as possible, and access to services. In the community that we were working, and as we've seen in other communities, often there were some services available, such as immunizations or prenatal care, but for often quite simple reasons, parents were not able to access those services. And whether it was a basic sort of had a bad experience with the health center and were concerned about going back, or didn't have transportation, what we found was that once an early years visitor was able to support that mom or dad or family, often the challenges they'd had in accessing that service could be mitigated. Early years visitors did have transportation. They have vehicles, which really helps support parents with some of those basic needs. Also providing things like diapers and formula as needed, healthy groceries, that kind of thing really helped make sure that basic needs were met so that visitors could start to support parents in thinking about their hopes and dreams for their baby, thinking about where their baby would sleep and preparing for their baby to come and taking the time to talk to their baby. All of those kinds of things can happen when some of those more basic needs are met. And so that was really the premise of the program. Very quickly after starting in Alberta, we started to receive some interest from other communities. A key point I would say is they weren't calling us and saying, we want exactly what's in Alberta. They were calling us and saying, we have something, we're running a preschool and we need more support for younger babies. Or we're running a home visiting program, but we don't know how to measure the impact. What we were finding was every community is doing something to support their children. But communities and organizations were reaching out and saying, we need a little bit more support or we need to enhance our services. And so we have been able to address those requests, and we hope to continue to address them as we grow. And we have been able to expand in that way. So the reason I put an emphasis on that difference is because I don't want to suggest that we have replicated the program in these different sites across the country, but rather, as communities identify interest, we work with them in a collaborative way to identify what it is their gaps are, how their services might be enhanced, and then we use what we've developed in the early years programming, or we develop new programming to meet those needs. And so in every community or community organization, the program looks a little different. And so across the country, currently today, we are working with the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate in Whitehorse, in the Ross River Dene Nation, in the Selkirk First Nation, in Nauchinayak Dun, and Vuntech-Gwitchin, all in the Yukon. And soon there will be actually 2 more communities will be joining that program. In Alberta, as I mentioned, where we started with the Ermineskin Cree Nation, we are also working with the Samson Cree Nation, Louisville, and Montana. We are working with Native Child and Family Services in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, as well as in Pond Inlet, Nunavut, and Rankin Inlet and Arviat, all in Nunavut. And we have just begun the development of the program in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq Nations of Nova Scotia and with the Inuit communities of Northern Quebec in Nunavik. And so that's sort of where we are at this point in the country. And as I mentioned, in each place, the program, how they're utilizing the program resources look quite different. And the other thing I would say is, as you can see from this, in some cases, it is a health authority delivering the program. And in other cases, it's an education authority, a preschool, or a child welfare agency. So as I mentioned, the approach is somewhat similar across all sites, and that is to provide programming and programming materials that begin prenatally to support families in customizable programming. And what I haven't mentioned yet, but I will talk about a little bit later, is the fact that in every community, the program and materials are culturally adapted to ensure that the lived experiences of the people delivering the program, parents themselves, as well as their cultural knowledge and traditional ways of knowing and being, are centralized in almost every case before the Western knowledge, so that it is the cultural knowledge that is prioritized and understood and supported by what Western science has since proved to be true. And so our guiding principles with every community that we work with are to follow the community's lead to ensure that we are not identifying gaps in programming or service, but community members are talking to parents, are talking to families and saying, what is it that you would like to see? And that we catalyze local knowledge to do that, to design the program. So again, the feedback of parents, of elders, of service providers at the community level, all have so much more knowledge than we ever could. And so ensuring that we're utilizing what already exists in the community is a critical element. As we all know, there is a huge amount of early learning research that is seemingly coming out every day, advancing the knowledge on the early years. And so ensuring that as much as possible, we are applying that research and implementing that research while ensuring that it is inclusive of less Western forms of research. So inclusive of the kinds of knowledges that also exist in community, the kinds of research and wisdom that has existed in the community for many, many years, for centuries. And finally, the last two, adapting and responding to cultural context. So ensuring that all programming is responsive to the cultural context we're working in. So while I mentioned that the programming was designed to be delivered in a home visiting context, in some communities, home visiting is not appropriate. And so the program looks a little different with one-on-one visits in a or group gatherings in a different kind of setting. And finally, measuring progress from the inside. So what that means is that measuring the impact of programs, engaging and collaborating with community members to really understand what does child success look like in your community, in your family, what does success look like? And then ensuring that our evaluation tools, our measurement tools are responsive to those realities, to the individual families as well as the individual communities, is something that we continue to work on. The ways that we speak about, measure, evaluate child development and developmental progress continue to evolve, but our goal is to ensure that those tools and those questions that are being asked and that analysis that is taking place is coming from the people, from the parents, from the practitioners, from the people that are closest to the ground, closest to the experience. And our goal being that we're able to show how incredible these children and families are, the amazing parenting that's happening, and the strengthening factors that already exist. We do, however, have some goals that we are attempting to reach. They're quite broad in scope, and they were the goals that when the first community we worked in, these were the goals established by the community that we were working in. And I would say that across the board so far, everywhere that we have gone, organization and community we've gone to, there has been agreement on these sort of basic goals. Of supporting healthy pregnancies, enriching children's pride in their identity and culture, enhancing language development overall, as well as school readiness, providing families with play-based learning opportunities, and strengthening parenting capacity and family well-being. And so, as I mentioned, in every community, we undertake a process to adapt the programming to meet their needs. And I would speak to this process as the way that we as an organization work with our partners, because it also mimics the way that staff at the community level, so early years visitors who are doing home visiting or hosting group gatherings or working in early childhood context, anybody utilizing the program materials or running a program that's supporting parents, undertakes a similar kind of process. And the first piece of that process, as we all know so well, many of you who are interacting with service providers on a daily basis, is building relationships. And when it comes to speaking about children and to engaging with parents about their children's well-being, that trust, as all of you know, is so fundamental. And we knew that we as an organization working with our partners and then our partners working with the families in their communities would get nowhere without those really strong foundational relationships. And those are relationships that begin and evolve and change and grow. And they really are with community leadership, but also with elders, parents and caregivers, other service providers. And they are all critical to developing the program at the beginning, but then also ensuring that as time goes on, that input continues to come in, that programming is a living, breathing entity that can change and evolve as parents' needs and families' needs change and evolve. And so the second big part of the process would be building momentum. So ensuring that, as I mentioned, as the program model is established, that it continues to grow, and that as momentum builds underneath it, gets behind it, more parents get involved, more children are born, more staff people from the community are hired, that it is allowed that room to grow and to change. And then the third kind of big component is, once that momentum has been established and something is really happening, ensuring that it can sustain itself. As we know, there are so many well-intended projects and programs that often are short-term, and our purpose, our hope is that every program that begins can sustain itself. So ensuring that that impact measurement is in place, that we're able to demonstrate the effects of programming, but also that those relationships have been sustained and time has been put into those so that they continue to enrich and anchor the program at the community level, and then the program with parents and families. So very quickly, just to the impacts we've seen, these are high level, and in the question and answer, I could speak more to some of the more detailed impacts, but over 50 people have been trained through the early years programming materials, and I can speak more about what those are, and I'm going to a bit, but over 50 people have been trained, and those are almost entirely Indigenous, primarily women, but Indigenous men and women. We have over 35 original culturally adapted learning resources that reflect cultural specificities of multiple communities. And today, there's over 300 families participating in early years programs in their communities. So the last thing I think I would speak to is the curriculum and training element of the program. So what I've talked to you so far about is how the program started, and the basic model of the program, a home visiting program that provides transportation, that provides one-on-one visits, as well as group gatherings. And I've spoken to you a little bit about how we design that program and get it started at the community level. But there is a big part of the program I haven't spoken about, and that is the curriculum and training. So when we started to develop the program, one of the things that community members said to us and organizational partners said was, we know what we want to do, but we need a little bit more structure. We don't want to tell parents what to do, but we want to ensure that our staff are well supported to engage in conversation with parents, to facilitate those conversations, and to see them on a consistent basis in a way that they can measure in some way and track. And they also said, we don't want it to be prescriptive. We don't want to be telling them what to do. We don't want there to be test to pass or wrong and right. We just want a little bit more structure. And we want the experiential knowledge of our people to be prioritized. So those community workers, in some cases, they're early childhood workers. In some cases, they're social workers. In some cases, as I talked, they're really early years visitors that are just home visitors. It varies a little bit community by community. But in every case, those are people who come from the community, who have a huge amount of experiential knowledge just from being from that place, but also in almost every case, are parents themselves and bring a huge amount of experience as parents. And so they said, we want to provide some training, but not that is prohibitive. That doesn't mean parents have to leave their community, or staff have to leave the community for 2 years and get a degree, or they have to take 2 years and do it at a distance, and it's a long-term thing. It needs to be something that is manageable for people to do within their community. And so we came up with 2 primary resources. One is called Understanding the Early Years, and it's a 45-hour training course, which is really a crash course in child development, beginning prenatally up until 5 years old. It weaves together Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge about early childhood development, taking that premise of, as I described earlier, cultural knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing and being dependent on the region are prioritized first and supported by the Western knowledge, what Western science has proved to be true. And, you know, we deliver it online and offline, but there's a huge amount of video content of people from their communities speaking about early childhood development, about pregnancy, about family well-being, as well as oral history, stories being told by community members, and then lots of discussion boards and discussion groups so that the people taking the course can also engage with each other, telling their own stories of childhood and of parenting. And then ongoing professional development in that same vein is a really important part of the ongoing training. And then the other component is called the Early Years Toolbox. And it's the resource that supports staff members, employees, when they are actually engaging with families. And so that's what I'm talking about, them asking for a little more structure. We came up with working with Red River College and their Science of Early Childhood Development, as well as Margot Greenwood, an early childhood education specialist and an Indigenous scholar based out of BC. Working together collaboratively and with lots of evidence and expertise from others, we developed the Early Years Toolbox, which is effectively a set of about 170 cards. They kind of look like flashcards, but really they are strategies, activities, and catalysts for conversation that span healthy pregnancies, the healthy pregnancy period, to language development, nurturing caregiving routines, meaningful moments, play-based interactions, and family well-being. And every interaction with a parent, there's often 1 to 2 cards introduced. And that might be something like eye contact and breastfeeding to start a conversation about how important that breastfeeding time is to start to build attachment, and making eye contact with baby, like what that does for that connection, to baby maybe starting to crawl or holding a drinking cup, and how parents can best support that development. And then in family well-being, the topics are things more like experiencing grief, changing family structures, immunizations, that kind of thing. And so the Early Years Toolbox is really key. And it's used in hard copy with parents, as well as during COVID, like so many of us, it went online. So there's a website as well as an app version of that really supports parents to engage in their child's development in a positive, strength-based way, with a little bit more structure. That's an example of one of the cards. So every card is context specific. So every region that we're in has a different set of cards with illustrations that are reflective of their context and community, as well as culture. So I think I would leave it there. I think I've maybe already gone over my time, Fabiana, but that sort of hopefully gives you a bit of an overview. And for this audience specifically, I think you're going to ask me about some of the preemie parents, but of course, I was looking forward to this conversation because many of the parents we work with do have the same experiences with premature babies that many of the parents you work with do.
Oh, Chloe, thank you so much for this presentation and to teach us about this program. I heard very recent about this program and I was in awe about all that is being done in the communities across Canada. It's such an incredible program. I'm very grateful that I learned much more today from you. So I think the first question is, how do families learn about this program in their communities?
Sure, yeah. So we work with we work with organizations primarily. So in each of the regions I mentioned, we're working with an organization. So in Alberta, we're working with the Health Service. In Toronto, we're working with Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. In the Yukon, it's with the Education Directorate. And so really the way that families find out is they're often already engaged in that service in some way in their community. And at the community level, there's lots of, Facebook and the radio and lots of promotion that way. At this point, the resources are not accessible if you're not involved in one of the organizational programs. We hope to, in the future, make the toolbox and the training available to other Indigenous early childhood educators and professionals working in the field. That hasn't happened yet, but we hope it will.
Wow, that is great. So let's talk a little bit about the preterm parents, because yes, it is our focus here in the foundation. So if a parent is enrolled from the get-go, from the early pregnancy, and then there is a complication of the pregnancy, or there is a preterm delivery, so how does this program stay involved while the parent is, for example, in the ICU for months at a time, and in many cases away from the community, far from their homes? So how the program still stays involved, or when the family goes back to the community, they resume the program?
Yeah, so it really is context specific, because sometimes the hospital might be an hour away from the community, and in other cases, the hospital might be a 3-hour plane ride away from the community. And so there's different ways, and we're still working out how to support families holistically with those longer distances. The first thing I would say is, as many people might know, Indigenous babies in Canada have a higher infant mortality rate than non-Indigenous, and the rate of preterm delivery for Indigenous babies is higher than the non-Indigenous population. Inuit families in particular have some of the highest preterm rates in the country. Inuit families have to often travel quite far to access services, to Iqaluit, to Winnipeg, or to Ottawa for high-risk pregnancies. So there are definitely challenges there. And even in communities that are not as far away from urban centers, transportation is a really big challenge, as well as so many parents listening probably, where to stay when you get to the city, being really far away from family, having other children and not having childcare for them. All of those challenges really get magnified the less resources that you have. And so the way that we try and support, I think the first piece is engaging prenatally is so important. Building that supportive connection when moms are pregnant. And about 30% of our program referrals are self-referrals. So those are parents that identify themselves to the program. And so what that means is we're starting to see earlier and earlier identification. Parents are calling us, at 6 or 8 weeks pregnant, which is really amazing to get to engage. And I know our early years visitors, to get to engage with a family that early on in their pregnancy is exciting, and a great opportunity to start to build that relationship, so that when something does potentially happen later on in the pregnancy, that relationship is already established. That parent isn't scrambling to find resources, that the program can help. So I think the first thing that we provide support with is transportation, is getting parents to prenatal care, but also if a parent is in the hospital, either with a preterm baby or with a baby that has an ongoing issue, getting parents there, getting them to and from is something that we help with. As well as making safety plans. So not that the baby's in danger, but ensuring that other children in the family are taken care of, that childcare is figured out, that other family members who might need to be involved are involved. I'm thinking of a delicate way to say this, but Indigenous people historically have not had the best experiences in the healthcare system in Canada. And so also just being in the room, being at the hospital, advocating for parents, as many of these parents know, being in that hospital room can be extremely overwhelming, not only stressful, but not knowing the answers. If you've had bad experiences with the healthcare system previously, it can make it an extremely stressful and difficult experience. So even just being there to ask those questions, to make sure that the doctors, the nurses, the healthcare providers are able to answer the questions parents have, and that parents understand what's being told, what their options are, their choices, what's happening with baby. I would say that is a huge role that visitors have played, just being able to be there.
So do they facilitate that conversation in hospitals, for example?
So
talking only the ICU. As you say, some kids do have medical complications later on. They can have several readmissions. So is there like a liaison person that helps the parents or the grandparents of that child to navigate the system?
Yeah, so in most of the hospitals that we're working in or healthcare facilities, there is often a liaison already there for parents, but they don't necessarily know about that person. And so a thing that the early years visitors do is they make sure that they're not necessarily the liaison themselves, but they're making sure that the parents know what's available to them, making sure the parents know that they have some supports. And if those supports aren't being provided, helping the parents to figure out why or how they can access them. And I think even when moms are pregnant, it's totally up to the mom or the family whether they have their early years visitor there. So in many cases, they'll say, can you come into my prenatal appointment with me? Or can you come to this visit? And part of the early years visitor's role is to provide that support. However, they are not healthcare providers themselves, so they have to be careful that they're really there as support people.
Wow, that is incredible. So when you talk about the preterm population and then you have the early years visitor, are they aware of extra challenges that preemie babies can have or the impact on the parents' mental health because they spend months sometimes in the ICU?
Yeah, so yes and no. I think that yes, they know about it, and I think it's definitely something that is known amongst visitors and that is witnessed as parents have those experiences, the enormous amount of stress and frustration and all of those things that happen. However, we haven't provided specific training on it. I guess that's what I would say. They haven't received specific training. And I think, well, that's something that we're hoping we can collaborate with you guys on the future to provide more resources for those visitors working with preemie parents, because I think you're right. Across the board, it's not really something that's talked that much about, and especially not in these communities where there's already a number of challenges associated with having babies in terms of accessing those services.
No, absolutely. No, and you mentioned like it is a problem across the board because even like public health nurses, they are not necessarily trained to deal with premature populations in the community. So it is a need for this ongoing training for everyone, what parents really face in the ICU. But one thing that really caught my attention when you're presenting is the fact that this program is not only for the mom, but for the dad and the extended family. Because I've learned very recently the role of the grandmother in the Indigenous population. And it's such a beautiful thing that we don't necessarily talk about, but how wonderful it is to extend it to the whole family. So what feedback have you had from like the grandparents or the aunts, the uncles that are involved in that child about this program?
Yeah, so we do track. We've been tracking when visiting happens, when a home visit happens, how many other family members are present. And what we have found is that almost half of the visits have someone else present. So that's another parent, another family member. I think about 20% of visits have a grandparent present at them if they're not the primary caregiver, as well as other siblings, older siblings. So we found that on average, while there is a baby in the program, there's at least 3 other family members also participating in the program. And I think what we have heard is that we started with only women visitors, and we definitely heard that dads needed to be more involved. And so we have hired in Musquetees, they have hired 2 dads who actually work with dads who are single dads with young babies. And they run group gatherings focused on dads. So they also work in families where there is a mom and dad are both present, but the males are building kind of a special relationship with the dad focused on his role. So I think that way we've gotten good feedback. And then in terms of engaging grandparents. I think grandparents are so precious to young children. And so we have tried to, of course, engage them in the home visits, but also create group gathering opportunities where elders are really the focus, and that elder interaction with young children is the focus. Not only is it important for the children, but like for that interaction, but that grandparents bring so much wisdom to the program, and they give us so much advice on how we should be doing things and how we could change things, and sharing stories, and that is just invaluable.
Wow, that is wonderful. Chloe, one last question that came here. How do you measure the impact of this program on the families? You touched a little bit on your presentation, but maybe you just give a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, so it's a tough one, because I think, how do you measure relationship building? It's the same way that I think the research has shown a lot of challenges in measuring parent-child interactions. How do you measure that? But we're trying. So I think there's a few things with qualitative research. So that is really just like case level evaluation. So how many visits happened, where they happened, how many times a staff member connected with a family, not just at their visit, but by phone, by Facebook Messenger, the services referred to. So visitors are often referring families to mental health services, to medical services, to housing, the food bank, all of those kinds of things. So tracking that so that we can see kind of the ripple effects of the program, as well as some more of the medical things like immunization rates at the community level for babies participating in the Early Years program, which I would say are significantly higher. And so those are some of the kind of quantitative things that we're measuring in an effort to really understand dose of the program, how much, how often makes a difference, as well as using the ages and stages questionnaire, so the ASQ questionnaire, throughout the program to kind of track child development and identify issues, developmental challenges if they're coming up. And then we use the early development instrument at school entry, so with 4-year-olds, to hopefully understand if there's an improvement in school readiness.
Wow, that's wonderful.
And then, of course, as you guys probably agree, the qualitative data, I think, is much richer, is so rich. And so that's really leading focus groups, interviews with parents and families. It's not as scientific for a mom to say, I really noticed a difference with my baby in the Early Years program and my older children. But for me, I think that's a very powerful feedback.
Absolutely. And on your website, you have a lot of beautiful quotes from parents who actually attended the program. They were absolutely inspiring. And beautiful to see the impact of the program. As I'm with you, I'm more on the qualitative piece. What is coming out of it? That is not really tangible, something that is harder to measure, but that is the impact of what is this community, helping and build on the community and better outcomes for everyone. So, Chloe, I'm so grateful that you joined us here today. What a wonderful program, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating with you in whatever will come for us, for the premature community.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And as I said, we, at MFI, we're really just a facilitator. I would say that at the community level, there's so many incredible staff and parents really doing the frontline work on a daily basis. And I'm privileged to speak on their behalf today, but certainly not representative of everybody that is delivering the programming.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chloe. And to all of you watching us live today, thank you so much for joining us here today. The video of today's session and all the videos of our live series are available on the CPBF website, which is right here, thecanadianpremiers.org. And I want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support to our education sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through support and education, we can empower families, ensure they are ready to care for their babies. please visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And I will see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay well.